The dark side of the internet. After viruses, worms and hackers, now a new frontier, cyber warfare. In the first incident of its kind, the US has said China rerouted global web traffic and during that time had access to all the data. Is cyberspace now the fifth battlefront? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. A sinister hijacking of the world's internet is being blamed on China. A US commission has said China managed to reroute traffic from US government and military websites, as well as corporate and international sites. Data was sent through its own servers for 18 minutes in April, and during that time, China could see and store everything that came through. It raises concerns about online security and highlights the new frontier in national security, with countries competing to control digital information. The US military now has a fully operational cyber command, but there are moves to coordinate such policies with other countries. Earlier this year, Russia proposed a cyber security treaty to the United Nations. On Wednesday, the US-China Economic and Security Review Commission reported to Congress it said China hijacked web traffic, but couldn't conclusively say that it was intentional. What normally happens is data is supposed to travel along the most efficient route, but this process can be manipulated. The US says China Telecom sent an incorrect message to other servers telling them that the fastest route to their destinations was through its servers, and over the next 18 minutes, that's the route they use. So think of it as traffic reporters for radio stations receiving a note telling them that the quickest way through a city was one particular road and broadcasting it to their listeners. About 15% of global web traffic was rerouted through China's servers during that time, affecting traffic to and from US government websites, including the Senate, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, NASA, and the Department of Commerce. And all that data could be accessed by China. Well, China has denied the accusation across the board, and its foreign ministry said the US Commission had a Cold War mentality. China Telecom Corporation denied any hijack of internet traffic. And a spokesman for the Chinese embassy in Washington said Chinese laws strictly forbid hacking or any other illegal activities that compromise the legitimate interests of China or any other countries. He went on to say the report was based on unfounded, groundless information, and it reaches unacceptable conclusions. For more on this fascinating subject, I'm joined by three guests in Doha. Technology journalist Kevin Anderson, in London, Rick Ferguson, Senior Security Advisor at Trend Micro, and Dave Clemente joins us from London with Chatham House's International Security Programme. Chatham House recently published a report on cyber warfare. So let's start off with you, David. Let's discuss these, what China calls unacceptable conclusions, and establish who was behind this and what the intentions were. Did China do this?
It certainly appears as if they did. This is slightly unusual in the world of cybersecurity issues in that we can attribute where the issue came from, which is so rarely the case with cybersecurity issues. We know that traffic was diverted through China. We don't know why, and we don't know exactly how, but they were able to cope with the flow of traffic, and it did pass through China. So they do have access to at least some of the information, and this is a great concern to the US.
What do you think the political game is that's been played here? The fact that the US blames China and is questioning China's motives when you consider that the same amount of sites were hacked in China?
Yes, there's larger political overtones here that play out in Washington and in Beijing. And I think the use by the US Commission of the word hijacked does add a slightly provocative tone to the report and to the story overall. It was a diversion, certainly, of traffic. Whether it was hijacked, I'm not sure that's the appropriate word to use. When similar incidents like this have happened previously, oftentimes traffic has been diverted, rerouted, and has resulted in chaos. Traffic has not been able to find its destination. Those are generally accidents, errors in the system. This doesn't seem to be a direct example of that. The traffic, by and large, was able to travel to its destination with minimal or no delay. So it does seem that perhaps this was maybe not an accident.
Rick, if the US say that they know who's behind this and they found out who was behind this, what do you think took them so long to get there? And surely if they know who is behind it, they can also find out what was seen and what was not seen.
It's certainly possible to state with confidence, where the rerouting started, where the false broadcast of routing information started, and what the net impact of that was. What's not possible to say with any great certainty, I guess, is exactly what data they had access to, because this was real-time traffic flow that would have included requests for web pages, it would have included email content. So there's no certainty about exactly what data was accessed, because you would need to collate all of that information from all of the many, I believe it was about 35,000 different domain names that were affected by the diversion.
And I gather that this was relatively easily to spot. I mean, traditionally, espionage tends to be conducted more secretively.
Yeah, and that's one curious thing about it. It's certainly, if you begin to reroute a large amount of internet traffic, people are going to notice. And it's not the first time it's happened. I mean, Pakistan did something similar, again, largely by accident, when it was trying to block access to YouTube for its own citizens. And that ended up blacking out YouTube for a large part of the internet. Turkey have done something similar in the past, again, by accident. And in fact, Napoleon Bonaparte said something that I think strikes a chord in this situation as well. He said, never ascribe to malice that which can be adequately explained by incompetence.
That's quite a good description if it's incompetence. Do you agree with that, Kevin? I mean, 18 minutes, it's quite a long time, isn't it?
Well, in internet time, not necessarily. And I think, to follow on from some of the comments previously, just having access to that traffic doesn't mean that they were able to decrypt any encrypted traffic, because obviously there would be some traffic that was encrypted during that, or analyze what the contents were. So we know the event happened. What happened with that information, that's the question, and whether it was intentional, that's another question.
Do you think they could have opened up a window for future snooping?
Well, again, this is not something that is difficult to do. It largely comes down to the fact that the internet operates on a trust-based system. The systems are all supposed to work together and pass along valid information, but currently, under the routing tables and routing information that's provided on the internet, it depends on people behaving in a trustworthy manner. So whether this is a mistake, whether someone just mistyped a number, completely possible or plausible, or whether it was intentional, some people have said it was to mask a larger attack. We just don't know.
David, what do you think? This was possibly a dry run for something bigger?
It could have been. It is a little bit suspicious, I think, that there was low to minimal disruption. Normally, again, when these sorts of incidents happened, as in the Turkey example, on Christmas Eve morning of 2004, it caused widespread outages across much of the internet. And people were not able to find their desired websites, and a general chaos ensued. This did not produce that effect, and whilst it's impossible to say that it was intentional, the Chinese certainly appeared well prepared to cope with what was an immense volume of traffic.
Rick, do you think that China has the capability of one day soon turning off the lights in the West, if it wanted to do so?
I think the real problem is that the protocols and technologies that underlie the internet were never really designed with security in mind. They were designed with resiliency in mind. And that's why things like broadcasting routing information, which is what we're talking about here, operates on this kind of honor system, because we need to allow different parties to take up the slack whenever it's necessary.
Big mistake, isn't it, knowing the way the world works?
It's because the internet, believe it or not, is actually a relatively old technology, and a lot of work is going on right now to try to redesign the protocols and rethink the protocols that underlie the way the internet works, to build security in at the root of things. But right now, the way that it works, TCP/IP, the IP address protocol, BGP, the protocol we're talking about here for broadcasting routing information, they operate on this honor system, and there's no built-in security for them.
Because ministers have been warned in Britain that China could shut down Britain. I mean, not that we're picking on China here, but they cited China, could shut down Britain with a cyber attack using BT's new 10 billion network. How would that work? How easy is that?
I think in order to shut down a country, quote unquote, It's a far bigger proposition than rerouting 15% of the traffic of the internet for 18 minutes, which, something which could easily have been done by accident. Certainly in terms of shutting down important infrastructure like power generation and important manufacturing, those kinds of strategic industries should not be directly connected to the internet anyway. They may rely on internet connectivity for transfers of data, but they shouldn't be directly accessible to anybody from the outside world. It certainly is possible to overwhelm web servers, internet servers with large volumes of traffic, which has the net effect of knocking them offline. But there are mitigating technologies that you can put in place against these denial of service attacks. So you may have limited success over limited periods of time, but to say that you could effectively isolate a country at the drop of a hat, I think is perhaps stretching things too far.
Let's try and establish what we're talking about here, if we have indeed entered this fifth frontier. David, you wrote this, co-authored this very interesting article on cyber warfare through Chatham House. Is the world under cyber attack at the moment?
No, I wouldn't say that it is. We pick out several different examples of things that might plausibly be considered cyber war, but most of the other things that are used as examples generally are not cyber warfare. So, for example, espionage in all its various forms in the physical domain is not, by and large, considered an act of war. But when it's talked about in cyberspace, it's often talked about in terms of this or that act of espionage was cyber war. And so I think oftentimes the debate can become centered around narrative, certain anecdotes that pop up into the consciousness. This one that we're talking about today, for example, this rerouting of traffic, but previous ones, earlier in the year, the Google incident, and before that, the Titan rain, which was believed to be Chinese espionage. All too often the debate tends to be centered around the latest large anecdote or rather scary story, which tends to persuade many people, public at large, that it could be quite easy to shut down an entire country, when in fact that's a near impossibility. I won't go so far as to say it isn't possible, but even a power grid in a country like the UK is a system of systems and immensely complex. And generally there is not one single point of entry or one single control room. And in addition, many of these systems are proprietary. So you have to have very specialized knowledge merely to understand how the system works, much less disrupt it.
That's rather heartening. Let me just tell you what the US Secretary of Defense said this week. She says there's a considerable current threat and a huge future threat. And the US President and Secretary of State are due to discuss cyber warfare with European Union top brass in Lisbon on Saturday. Cyber attacks are increasingly common. In 2008, a flash drive infected a US military laptop in the Middle East with a virus. It spread onto classified networks and collected data for what's thought to be a foreign intelligence agency. Later that year, Google said it was the victim of a highly sophisticated and targeted attack. We touched on that a little bit earlier on, originating in China. It said the aim was to gain access to the email accounts of Chinese human rights activists. And a few months ago, a worm was discovered in Iran's Bushehr nuclear power facility. The Stuxnet worm has been described as the world's first cyber missile, but the operator said the facility was not harmed. But Kevin, we find out now from a recent report that this facility could well have been harmed with the technology that had been used.
And just today there was a report in the New York Times saying that there was evidence from security researchers that it definitely was a targeted attack in some way. And the reason that they believe that is because the programming was designed, it affected industrial systems that control a number of electrical motors, including centrifuges for the enrichment of uranium. And it would cause those centrifuges to spin up to such a rate that they might damage themselves or even rip themselves apart. So there is quite a bit of circumstantial evidence to say that whoever designed it had that intent.
Well, a nightmare scenario, certainly. Rick, tell us how these teams operate, because surely working on the internet, you are easily trackable, are you not? So how do they operate in secrecy?
Yeah, this question relates, I guess, far more closely to the world of cybercrime, but obviously similar techniques are used for cyber espionage as well. First of all, people make sure that a lot of their traffic is proxied through many different connections. So let's say that I want to tell you something. I'm going to ask a series of 5 or 6 unrelated individuals to pass the message along to you, which makes it impossible for you to know where the message actually originated. And that same technique is used online. What criminals will tend to do is they will already have compromised a large number of computers into what we call a botnet, or a network of compromised PCs, and they can use every individual one of those compromised PCs as an onward connection point to proxy their traffic.
Now, much of this technology, excuse me interrupting, is massively expensive, isn't it? So you'd assume that there'd be somebody behind them funding it.
You know, if we talk specifically about the Stuxnet worm, the worm that was affecting power plants, then yes, that was a very, very well-funded activity. The people behind that needed access to the kinds of equipment they were trying to compromise. They needed specialized coding, and they needed a lot of inside knowledge. So for that particular project, yes, that was well-funded. If we talk about online crime in general, which to my mind is actually a much greater threat than the threat from cyber warfare, then the barriers to entry to the world of online crime that used to exist, and I mean things like the cost of criminal software or the level of expertise or knowledge needed to enter the world of cybercrime, have largely disappeared. You can get absolutely free of charge access to criminal toolkits and criminal software, and they're designed in such a point-and-click interface that an absolute beginner could operate them with impunity.
It must make you wonder, David, how you actually get your hands on these guys sitting behind computers, many of them working in secrecy. I know that NATO is meeting at the moment. They're talking about the threat of this cyber warfare. What do you think their response should be? Should there be a coordinated international response?
Ideally, yes, though that's immensely difficult to do regardless of the domain that you're talking about, whether it's land, air, sea, space, or cyberspace. A political framework would be highly useful. All too often the narrative of cyber insecurity is dominated by the technologists or the military. Not exclusively, but that tends to, those tend to be the crowds that lead the debate, in part because they're the ones that are at the leading edge. They're involved on a daily basis. And policymakers often have a great deal of difficulty understanding the complexity of the topics we're talking about, not least today with this rerouting of traffic. How that physically happens can be quite difficult to explain in simple terms or just in very straightforward terms for decision makers who may be unused to dealing with this. So I think what would be highly useful is to bring more politics into the discussion. So a more highly informed political strata that can engage with these topics. Some of this will happen over time as policymakers, young people now, become senior policymakers and have a better grasp of the speed and complexity of changes in cyberspace. Cyberspace is highly politicized at the moment, but in our report we argue that cyberspace should be bounded by a political framework of norms, ethics, and values. Now, that's quite a long ways away from happening, but it would be helpful if the discussion could be entered into sooner rather than later. All sides will probably see the issue very differently, but if a discussion can begin, then you can bring the discussion away from war and warfare and into the realm of political agreements and international engagement. Okay,
and Kevin, what would you advise from a technical point of view?
From a technical point of view, I think this incident really raises the issue of ending this trust-based relationship. When the internet was created, and you know, as has been said before, this is quite 30-year-old, 40-year-old technology. Everyone who ran the internet knew each other. So it was a human trust network. Everybody knew each other, and they abided by certain rules. Now that the internet is not only international, but so much more complex, and you've got international companies and governments and agencies running and working it, then it really does require not only the technical systems, but also, as was said now, political systems, so that we're no longer just sort of on a handshake and hoping that everyone behaves themselves well, that we hope that continues the operation of the network. So it's going to require security to be built in, not just resiliency, as been said, and also some political agreements. So it's going to happen on 2 levels.
Rick, what do you think the political thinking is behind catching the bad guys when they do get their hands on the protagonists. And if I can cite the Gary McKinnon example, I mean, he's been hounded for basically exposing weaknesses.
Yeah, you know, I think something that's really key that policymakers and lawmakers need to focus on is getting that framework in place for the harmonization of laws across jurisdictions, because at the moment that doesn't exist. And if you consider the efforts that have been made, there was the Convention on Cybercrime back in 2001, which was signed by a large number of countries. Unfortunately, some countries didn't sign it. Countries like Turkey, for example, didn't sign it, and it's a big and important player in the world of cybersecurity. But even more unfortunately, many of the countries that did sign it have still not yet ratified that very first convention, including the UK. So I think, you know, we need to press our politicians and our policymakers to put more emphasis on harmonizing laws across geographies so that we can, using the intelligence gained from the security community, pursue far more successful prosecution of individuals involved in cybercrime.
And do you think it's fair that governments ask small companies, marketing companies, for example, for information in their battle against cybercrime? Isn't that snooping too far?
Certainly, I mean, if you take a company like the company I work for, Trend Micro, which is an internet security company, it's a standard part of what we do to research online criminal behavior. And if any of the intelligence that we gather can help prosecute the people behind the behavior, then we're more than happy to share that. Obviously, we use it to protect our customers, but if we can use it to protect the wider world as well, then we clearly do, and we share regularly data and information with law enforcement agencies and governments as we need to.
And what sort of tool am I for those who want to conduct nefarious deeds? I'm rather naive when it comes to using my computer. I often have Facebook open. Am I a danger?
Well, for cyber warfare purposes, just in a very straightforward sense of ideally they would like to, you know, hijack your computer and use it as part of a larger botnet for perhaps a very simple denial of service attack. But there's another aspect of it as well, which is that your personal information on social networking sites or perhaps personal information banking details stored on your computer could be very useful in terms of cybercrime. And often there's an overlap as well between cybercrime and cyber war, or perhaps the economic aspects of cyber war. And so this blurring is creating an increasingly complex landscape that governments find very difficult to deal with. So I think, to sum it up, you're probably most useful when you leave your computer unguarded and spread personal details, even seemingly innocuous ones, around on the internet.
Kevin, what can I do to make myself more safe?
Well, going back to that issue of personal details, just being aware that, you know, having your birth date posted online is a bad first step. That is a first step to identity theft. So simple things that you might be sharing on social networks actually could be used to steal your identity. You know, as has been said before, you know, keeping your systems up to date and having some kind of antivirus software. It's been talked about botnets. What these are basically, someone can take over your computer, and now there are markets online where criminal gangs are auctioning off compromised computers to launch attacks against commercial interests, like, let's say, banks. So it really does become absolutely critical that, you know, when you see that, update your software, update your antivirus, that you keep current with that.
Well, scary and exciting topic at the same time. Thanks there to Kevin Anderson, also to Rick Ferguson and David Clemente. And that takes us to the end of this look at cyber warfare, the new frontier, or is it? Here on Inside Story. If you've got anything to add or want to comment on the subject, please email your suggestions to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Goodbye for now.